Hey there, I want to address a couple things. First of all, if you want to talk to me, don't, please, for your own sake, do not leave your phone number on the comments, okay? Someone left comments because they want to talk to me, they left their phone number. If you go to my About section, you go to my website and email me. I prefer to email anyway. There's just boundaries in my home with my marriage and family, and email, I can control the pace of the conversation and think about what I'm going to say before I say it and stuff like that. So I'm open to people communicating and love to hear from you and love the fellowship, but I talk to very few. It's not a safe world out there. Anyway, the other thing I want to talk about a little bit more about Jesus and the 613 laws or commandments. Jesus, the law is spiritual, good, and holy, right? Now that law specifically is talking about the 10 Commandments. But the whole of the law was given to Israel through Moses as a covenant 400 years after the everlasting covenant that really secures their salvation. It was given for transgressions, and according to Hebrews and 2 Corinthians, it's waxing old and passing away. It is a shadow that points to who Jesus is. Jesus is perfectly righteous. And no, he did not break any of the 10 Commandments. He's perfect. But his righteousness is the reality, and the 10 Commandments are the shadow. And the law was given to expose sin, not define God's righteousness. God dwells in unapproachable light. No one has ever seen him, and if anyone sees his glory, they will not live. So when Moses said, "Let me see your glory," God said, "You can't see my face, or you shall not live, but I will hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I will pass by, and you will see my hinder parts." So literally the back end, okay? The shadow cast as God passed by. And Moses beheld his glory. And from that incident, he came down with the 10 Commandments in one hand, I guess, and the blueprints for the tabernacle with all the instructions for the priesthood in the left. And God told him that he was to erect these things according to the pattern of the reality he had seen in the heavens. And we are told in Hebrews that what he constructed was a pattern and a shadow of the real things that existed in heaven, which are actually Christ himself, the glory of God, okay? So they do depict God's glory, but they can't hold it or bind him, okay? With a shadow, if you look at a shadow on the floor, you can see the general shape of my outline. You can see, oh, that's probably a man. But you can't see what color my hair is. You can't see my face. You can't see if I'm bearded. All that. You'd have to turn and look at my face. So the shadow cannot fully encapsulate what I am as a man. You have to see the reality. And that wasn't available at that time. So they had the shadow. So when we say that Jesus' righteousness was witnessed by the law but manifested apart from the law in Romans 3, what it's saying is that the law didn't bind him and put him in a cage and say, this is everything about his righteousness. No, his righteousness was manifested again in that he died for sinners, the ungodly, those who are alienated in their mind and because of wicked works and were enemies of God. And he drew them near to himself and he reconciled them, but he did it in a perfectly just way. And so the manifestation of God's righteousness is that he's just and the justifier of those who believe in Jesus, even though they're ungodly and they work not. Now, the Ten Commandments, that you can't find anything in the Ten Commandments that tell you that God needs to do that, right? And yet, the gospel tells us that God's righteousness was manifested in the propitiation, specifically. This act of redemption, the death of Christ. Now, the Bible says in Romans 1 that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith, but the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against sin. Okay? Where is it revealed? In the law. The law works wrath. The purpose of the law is to reveal God's wrath and disapproval of sin. Now, God's wrath and disapproval against sin was already in play because man had already fallen into sin after Adam's fall. And according to Romans 5, sin was in the world and death reigned over man from Adam to Moses, even before the law was in the world. So sin was there before the law came and defined it. Sin, just like it doesn't fully encapsulate God's righteousness, but shadows it, the law also doesn't create sin, right? Sin is already in the picture, and judgment and death is already there, even apart from the law. And that's how God can judge the Gentiles. The Gentiles aren't under the law. How can they be responsible? Well, because they were in Adam, and Adam fell, and they all fell into sin, and sin and death reigned. And they're a law unto themselves because of their conscience. So again, the law that was given through Moses is a picture. Okay? And yes, it is fulfilled in Christ in the sense that it points to him. But Christ exists independently of the law. Christ exists, he doesn't need the creation to validate his existence or Sinai to validate his existence. He is before he did anything. Then he created the universe, and eventually after man fell, he gave the law to define and diagnose the situation that man was in and point to God's righteousness. But his righteousness exists independently of all that. That's what we're trying to say. And it is hard to speak to because it's subtle. Now, as far as the Aaronic priesthood goes, the tabernacle with its ordinances, those laws applied to the priesthood, and you had to be of Levi to participate in that priesthood. And Hebrews makes it very clear that Jesus was not of Levi. He was of Judah. And has nothing to do with that priesthood except that it prefigured his sacrifice and showed that there was an obstacle in the way that man could not get into the Holy of Holies. Showed that the way into the holiest had not yet been manifested. And that there was a temporary situation in place where sacrifices could cover sin but not perfect the worshipers. It was a temporary covenant. And sin is not defined by, I don't believe, by the Aaronic priesthood. Like, you and I are not guilty of violating Aaronic priesthood laws for not, if we're a Gentile, we're not under the Sabbath, for example. Seventh-day Adventists make that error, right? They say, well, God's law is binding, and you broke the Sabbath. They're trying to keep everybody under the Sabbath. No. God's law was part of the covenant that was given through Moses to Israel, and the Gentiles have nothing to do with it. It is a temporary covenant, and it is waxing old. And it's got two parts. It's got the moral law, which is called a ministry of condemnation and death, and it's the letter that kills. And then it's got the ceremonial law, which applied mainly to the priests of the Levitical line. Again, Jesus' priesthood is after the order of Melchizedek because no one from Judah can ever serve as a priest. And, the Pharisees said something to Jesus when he was, eating grain from the field, And his answer was, hey, well, didn't David go into the house and take from the showbread, which nobody was allowed to do? The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Which means that he has the authority to do whatever he wants with the Sabbath. And it doesn't compromise his righteousness. He worked on the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath. The Pharisees said, you just told that guy to get up and take his bed on the Sabbath. Now, it is true that they had added laws to it. But there was a guy who got stoned in the book of Numbers for carrying sticks on the Sabbath. It was a pretty severe penalty for breaking the Sabbath. I'm not a Jew under that time, but Jesus said, Jesus didn't say, no, I'm not working. You're lying. You're adding your laws to it. No, he said, my Father works, therefore I will work. And the point of the Sabbath is to bring man into rest so that Jesus can work. You do not have the reality of the Sabbath until you've got Jesus. Just like in the whole Sabbath was a picture of the rest of God, which the only reality of that rest was in the Holy of Holies. And yet only the high priest could go in there once a year with blood. So no one, even if they did stop working, was actually enjoying the reality of the Sabbath. The reality of the Sabbath really didn't come until Christ gave us the living water, the Spirit, and the veil was opened, and we had access to him. He is our rest. Rest is not just not working. Christ is our rest. Again, Christ is the reality, and all these things are a shadow. His righteousness is not defined by the fact that he keeps the law. No, the fact that he's morally righteous leaves a shadow, and that shadow is the law. Now, that doesn't mean he breaks the law. We're not saying he broke the moral law. But the Sabbath laws for the priesthood, that's a little fuzzier of an area. Was he bound by them? No, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath for man to enter into rest. And now he came as the reality of the tabernacle of God among men, the Holy of Holies. So, another thing that was, we'll leave it at that. So when we say, Jesus kept the 613 laws, all of them, so that you don't have to, that's just not correct. Because the Gentiles were never under the 613 laws or ordinances of the Aaronic priesthood. Okay? So that, yes, John says that sin is the transgression of the law. But that is really speaking of God's moral law, his eternal nature. Not the Aaronic priesthood, which was temporary and prefigured a time of reform where a new priesthood and resurrection would come to play, in which there's a king and a priest, a king who is a priest, Melchizedek. And that priesthood was officially inaugurated in the day of Jesus' resurrection, where he said, this day I have begotten thee. I will declare the decree, you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek forever. And that is the priesthood where he upholds the body of Christ with his life. And he brings himself to us as bread and wine. So it is a complicated subject. And it's a little too deep, really. This is one of those things where I wish some of us just had a channel that was only accessible to our subs so we could have these conversations. Because it's part of the meat of the word. But what we have is these public channels where people are kind of like floating in and out. They're not part of the whole conversation. They take what we say and respond, And then other people who don't like us for various reasons respond to that, and then it turns into a big thing. And I don't know how to help that. Like I said, I'm still investigating how can we have a forum. I would like to have a forum or a channel that's subscriber only for about 5 or 6 channels that I associate with, where we could just put our content free from this so-called community. Again, I didn't come here to join a community. I came here to speak what is in me and what I've been through and what I see as pitfalls. And I taught on vicarious law keeping since the beginning of my channel. I've done videos on it. That was not a response to someone or something. But it is true that people teach it, and I hear it quite a bit. Vicarious law keeping is that the idea that part of his justification of us is his law keeping. No, his righteous life qualified him for his death and to be the spotless offering, right? But that righteousness was not just a righteousness of law keeping. It was the righteousness of someone who always does that which is pleasing to the Father, to the depth of his being. The law could paint a picture of it by saying, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But only Jesus shows us what the reality of that is. He said, my Father loved me because I gave my life for the sheep. And, the Chuck Missler used to give an example. He said, imagine the Father and the Son, and they're standing there looking at the planet Earth, and the Father says to the Son, I love those people. Do you? Yeah, I love them too. Well, here's the thing. They're devouring each other down there. They're a bunch of dogs, literally. They've turned into dogs. And I need you to go down there and save them. Okay, I can do that. I love you, Father. Okay, but here's the thing. These are ravenous wolves. And I need you to become one of them in order to be identified with them. What? Okay, all right. I bet I could do that, This is imaginary. Well, then, he says, well, here's the thing. You're not going to be a wolf. You're going to be a poodle. You're going down as a poodle, and they're going to literally devour you and tear you apart. They're going to kill you. But I'm going to raise you up on the third day. But here's the thing. You're going to be a poodle forever. I'm going to give you everything, but you're going to be a poodle forever, and you're going to bear the marks of their biting and devouring. But that's the only way you can save them. Don't you love them? I love them. Yeah, I love them. And so he said that's just a pale comparison to show that the manifestation of God's love and his righteousness in giving his Son was that the Son condescended to become a man, to partake of flesh and blood like us, and to live 30 years in the mundane, not just in the exciting 3 years of his ministry, but in the mundane daily grind that we all have to go through. Having to learn, having to be subject to his parents, having to go through all the different things that kids go through and wait for 30 years. The King of Glory lived in this way. Born in a manger, lived in a poor town in a bad area, never knew luxury, right? And then became the minister and was rejected of men and fought all the way and then was devoured by the wolves at the cross. And not only did man put him on the cross, but Satan attacked him there too. The principalities came against him, the bulls of Bashan, and he terminated all of it. Then he died and rose again, but when he rose again, he was still disfigured from the scars. And even Mary thought he was the gardener. She didn't recognize him, and it's because he still bears the scars. And Chuck Missler did a 6 Hours in Eternity, I think that was called, and he'll bring you to tears in that teaching. Because he said, why didn't Mary recognize him? Well, don't you remember? His beard had been pulled off, and his face had been disfigured. So many of them didn't recognize him. He was beaten beyond recognition. It says he had, and it talks about that in Isaiah. He gave his beard to this, they pulled it off, and he no longer looked like men. He was so disfigured from everything he went through. We know he kept the scars in his hands and in his side. But why was everybody so slow to recognize him? And they say the only thing made in heaven by man is the scars of Jesus. And in Revelation 4, it says that he stands as a lamb freshly slain, as if he's just endured all this. In other words, he still bears the marks. And that is a badge of honor for him. And that, according to the Bible, is the manifestation of his love and his righteousness. Where can you find that in the law? You can see that the law says that there's going to be a lamb and all these things. But can you see God becoming a man? And not only that, but staying a man forever? To reconcile not just the righteous, but the most ungodly, vile sinner. The person who has no right to come near to the Lord without being consumed. So that's just something to think about. What we're saying is that this righteousness far exceeds anything we could describe with words, even though the word does point to it. And we're also saying that that covenant was not given to the Gentiles. We're not under it. The covenant of Moses. And we're saying that Jesus' righteousness is not a matter of law keeping. It is a matter of his person and his life and his mission and what he actually did. It's so much higher. And so he went so much farther beyond anything we could imagine. And it was his righteousness that caused him to do it. You know, he could have been righteous and just come and reigned as a king with a rod of iron. And then just let us live and die and thrown us into the lake of fire. And he'd still be righteous. But he became a man to identify himself with us so that he could bring us into his position of glory. Okay, gotta go. I'll talk to you later.